Officially welcome you. This is our diversity and inclusion and equity training for charter school leaders. And we're so excited to have you here today and to engage in this important topic and this important conversation. Today's training will be provided by Casey Dupart, and she's the diversity of equity, diversity and inclusion with USBE. I'm going to read a short bio about Casey, and then we'll turn the time to her and let her lead us through this meeting. So Casey Dupart is an accomplished K-12 administrator, school psychologist, and licensed behavior analyst who has built a versatile career in the K-12 environment. She is the current director of equity, diversity, and inclusion with the Utah State Board of Education. She previously supported USBE as the multi-tiered system of support, or you may have heard MTSS, specialist and the behavioral and support mental health needs specialist in special education. Casey has a stellar reputation in the education field as being one who is a great listener and collaborator. Her skill set as a school psychologist, behavior analyst is top-notch, and her colleagues across the state honored her by selecting her to serve as president of the Utah Association of School Psychologists. She has supported students across various settings, living in Italy, Maryland, Texas, North Carolina, and Utah. As an Air Force spouse, she has worked across the education spectrum, supporting students from infancy to early adulthood within the homeschool and clinic settings. Casey partnered with the National Association of School Psychologists to serve on the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force. She also supports the School Collaboration Committee with the Utah Association for Behavior Analysis and is an active member of the Utah Coalition of School-Based Specialists. So as you can see, we've got a great expert on this topic. We're so excited for Casey to present, and I'll keep helping to facilitate getting individuals into our meeting, monitoring chat, but otherwise enjoy your time with Casey, and we will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Marie. I want to make sure I can share. Awesome, I can see it popping up for me. All right, let me know, thumbs up if you can see the screen with the presentation on it. Fabulous, and I will start from this slide, and I'll make sure that I can see you all. There we go, I got the chat up. Good. And I'm going to put in the chat box the Padlet, and I'll kind of navigate how to access that. I do hear some feedback, someone's unmuted. Okay, so we're gonna kind of talk about a lot about
Is
equity,
it just
diversity,
me
and inclusion. Okay, now we're good. So I'm going to cover some.
Is it just me? I'm really having a hard time hearing.
I'm here fine.
Marie, can you hear me? Okay. All right, I'll move my mic closer.
I'm not hearing. Am I on? I can't hear you. It's coming in and out. Am I the only one?
I think you may be the only one. I'm getting the chat box that everyone else can hear. All right, I'll move forward. All right, so I'm going to put in the chat box a Padlet that I created so you can access. Can you please mute yourself, sir? Thank you. All right, so I'm going to put the link to the Padlet back in. This is a Padlet that I update regularly to provide you resources on how to improve practices around equity. And it's from a lens of supporting all students. So supporting students who are multilingual learners, students with disabilities, students who are queer, giving you just best practice. And I update it frequently just so you have access to, okay, what does this look like? What does this look like in navigating support in the pandemic and remote instruction and a lot of inconsistency and uncertainty. So it's something you can access using the Padlet app, or you can go to the website. So that's for you. And that's what it looks like. And a lot of what I referenced today, we'll talk about from the Padlet. But feel free to ask questions. When I create these, I create them uniquely for each conversation. So you're school leader, so I thought of that. And giving you context to what you're navigating, because it's not helpful for you and it's not helpful for me if I don't think of the context and what it looks like within your school settings. So you're going to see a lot of content today around that in your current climate, because I want to give you tools and I want you to feel empowered in the work that you're doing. Let's start off with putting names in your current roles in the chat box. I kind of like to see who's here, where you are, where you're representing across Utah. And while you do that, you'll see today I'll utilize the chat box and I use poll everywhere to kind of get an idea, to get you involved and engaged in the conversation so it doesn't feel like I'm lecturing. Awesome, okay. Bless, okay. American, Beehive Academy, welcome. Some board members are here. Welcome, board members. All right. And as Mary mentioned, I'm the current Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I've been in Utah about 4 years. This is move number 6 in the last 16 years. And I've been able to support, beginning in Park City, and now I'm at the State Board of Education. I've moved around a little bit, worn a lot of hats, lots of good experience. All right, so let's go over the norms. With and I want to give you some tools on these conversations with me with multiple perspectives, especially with, and my colleagues are on here, there's a lot of unlearning and re-education in this work in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and you need to be able to navigate that and build that tolerance and that stamina, because you may not have learned it correctly or had the entire story the first time. And that's what I found in doing this work as I've navigated it. And also recognizing the power in positionality and recognizing power. It's not something that I've noticed we talk about a lot within our country, but recognizing positionality, recognizing the differences in access and opportunities, but remembering, especially for us as educators, to student focus, remembering like, how does this apply in the education setting and how does this apply to students? And then recognizing the value of everyone. That's been very powerful for me in understanding that there's some behaviors that we have normalized that are not necessarily respectful or valuable in this conversation. So anytime, and that's something I've talked to my colleague, the equity specialist, is let's remembering the value. And if we're using language that's devaluing, let's redirect from doing that. So this is a safe space, but it's also a brave space, and teaching ourselves that we're here to get it right and not necessarily be right. Because like I said before, and you're probably hearing me say this a lot today, is there's a lot of unlearning and re-educating in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I do it daily. And I'm always telling my leadership team, there's a lot of learning to do, and that's okay. We work in education. We're going to cover a lot because I want to give you the context and I want to give you tools and I want you to feel like you can do this work. So if you don't have an equity person that you feel that you are capable of having those conversations, but I highly encourage every campus that I support across the state of Utah, you want to have some with improving your practices around inclusion, and contact me and you can start thinking about, so who should be on staff, because we want to make sure that you have someone. Again, we want you to feel empowered and supported that you can do this within your setting. All right. So let's talk about and how you can text -591 to 37607, or you can go to pollev.com, my first and last name 591. But I want you to kind of let me know what really comes to mind, the first thought, because I know it's something that we hear a lot, implicit bias. I know I've heard it increasingly in the last year. What implicit bias? And you can in poll EV, my first and last name, 59, or you can text Casey Dupart 591 to 37607. What have you heard? What do you think you know about it? You may not. I'm getting from Holly, she's recommending that everyone turn off their cameras because the sound is an issue. So if your camera is on. And I see in the chat box, rather than being neutral, we each have a preference. Yes. Self-awareness, stereotypes, attitudes, conscious, assumptions, interrogating. Interrogating assumptions. Good. So it sounds like some of you've heard of that phrase. The takeaway with implicit bias is to know that it's something that you don't really think about. You don't really are even aware of yourself when you're doing it, but we all make those snap decisions about people based off of what we've been taught to think about them, right? Or what I found when I look at the research, I'll go to the next slide, is that usually when you are having conversations around implicit bias in your training staffs, especially in education, you'll find that you'll have better relationships with your students and with your community members because you're recognizing some of those snap judgments that you make about people that you may not be familiar with. And a lot of the research I found that showed that teachers actually improved when it came to training around implicit bias, their expectations for students, because they were able to recognize, hey, you know, I might be making snap decisions about what the student can do. Let me change how I support. Let me change how I instruct. And the same with if you have a support staff, like I'm school psychologist and behavior staff, you'll have better behavioral interventions, less referrals to special education that are unnecessary because you're improving your practices around, oh, let me make sure that I am not devaluing students and I'm not determining their worth based off of my implicit biases. So there's a lot of value in recognizing these things and being aware of them and having training on them. And I'm recognizing that we don't always get that in our education training programs. So it's helpful that you have these conversations, you provide that professional learning so educators feel empowered and understand why this is important to understand how it influences your work. Also, implicit association tests are very helpful. Harvard does those. It takes about 10 minutes. I'm not going to do them today because they take time, but I highly recommend that you do these with your colleagues and that you take time to do at least one. Even if it's in one of your staff meetings, let's quickly all come together and do an implicit association test. I do them with my staff and it's very insightful. There's a lot of them and I just gave you some, but they do a lot of implicit association tests around skin tone and weight and religion and gender. And you don't think about it because you're living, but you make a lot of quick decisions. And I found within education, they can have long-term outcomes if you're not aware. I can do that, board member, or I can show you the research. I sit on the National Association of School Psychologists task force, and we've compiled a lot of research on implicit association, implicit bias, and I can pass that along to you because it helped us improve practices as school psychologists. All right, microaggressions. let's go into those. So it might be a term that you're hearing, and I want to give you kind of some context around like why microaggressions are something that we're talking about. It's very quick, again, just like the implicit bias. It's something that is usually denigrating. And what I mean by that, usually devaluing, is usually you don't say it to certain people, but you say it to others. And that wants to be aware. Because while you are so articulate, usually I get feedback from the field. It's, oh, Casey, isn't that a great thing? Like, it depends on who you're saying it to. Think about, who do you say these things to? You don't say them to everybody. So, and that's why I wanted to give you specific examples. They are just raised that way. Where are you really from? And with where are you really from, there's a presumption that that person has to give you their ancestry so they can fill you in on why they exist. And that's usually very invasive. It's usually socially inappropriate and uncomfortable for that person receiving that statement. Or you're really pretty for A. Anytime you have to say for A, that's usually you are great for whatever community you belong to. So being mindful of some of that, because I know it's like, oh, why that word is a weird word, microaggressions. This is kind of helping you to break it down, what it means and how it comes across to that person. So with aggressions, they can be verbal, they can be nonverbal or environmental or unintentional, something that you think of, and I see it a lot. It's very flippant. It's just, oh, I have this thought and now I'm communicating it, and you're not necessarily always thinking of how it's received to the person hearing that statement. And we usually try to explain it away and come up with a rationale. But what I'm finding, what I have to remind myself for, is a lot of humility in this work too, is that you don't necessarily determine if what you said was offensive or not. It's the person who's receiving that, who's listening to that. They determine that, even if you may have intended it a certain way. So let's talk about intersectionality. Again, I thought of words and topics that you all are probably hearing, and I want to give you the language so you can understand some of the environment. So intersectionality, it comes from research, I believe, that looked specifically at women of color, Black women, and how they weren't necessarily being receiving raises and promotions. I want to say it was in a car factory company. And they couldn't understand it, like, you know, they're suing for discrimination, but how can the Black men are being getting promotions and they're getting raises, and I don't understand. But what they found was the intersection of that multiple marginalized identities. So being a Black person and a woman led to them not always getting the promotions that their Black male counterparts, and that led to a whole body of research around intersectionality based off of different marginalized identities. So you see here, it can be anything from class to gender to ethnicity to religion, sexuality, disability, or age. But it's getting us to understand the different layers that all of us have. You're not just one thing. You're not just a woman. You're not just a person with a disability. You're not just a part of this religion. You as a person, you're multidimensional, and our students are multidimensional. So, excuse me, bud. My cats like to pop up when I'm talking. You'll see them from time to time. But with experiencing intersectionality, it's helpful for us as educators is recognizing what our students come in the door with. I think sometimes we become very narrow because we're very busy and you're trying to make quick decisions and you have timelines, limited resources. But I found as a school psychologist, behavior analyst, my interventions were so much better when I looked at my students from that multifaceted lens. I was able to see, and they were very honest with me. My students, especially moving around so much, I remember having middle school students who would tell me, and they were very honest, and I had to step into that discomfort with them. I had a middle school girl who told me in Maryland, she was like, Miss Dupart, you're inside the fence with me. And you get this because you're inside. And I knew what she was talking about. She was talking about race. She was saying, you're Black. You're a Black woman. You get some of my experiences because of your Blackness. And I had to, in that moment, own that, step into that discomfort and help her navigate her experiences around her ethnicity and being a Black girl in Maryland. Had another experience with a young Black male in North Carolina, and we were in a counseling session, and he was like, you know, Ms. Dupart, that's great that you're a school psychologist, but I don't see that for me. And again, having to have those very real, humbling conversations with my students, and they're talking about what it's like for them, and they're aware of race, and they're aware of their socioeconomic status, and they're aware of where they could be. And he was telling me, like, I don't see that for me, and I had to be honest about the steps I could take in that conversation. I could say, I don't want to talk about that, but I wanted to give him tools of, yeah, you are a Black male, and you are, I think he was 13 or 14. And how can I still empower you and give you the support, even though you don't feel powerful right now, even though you don't feel like you could go to school, go to college, you don't feel like you have those resources. How do I help you navigate this climate? That's what I'm here for as your school psychologist. So what I found when I am aware of them and I see them for all their humanity, not just the pieces that are what I was told to talk about, because I feel like in our pre-service, this is very clear cut. It's going to be easy. And then you go into the schools and you're dealing with so many different issues that you didn't really have a lot of that context in your pre-service. And so that's when I'm having this conversation with you. I want to be mindful of that, because you're dealing with very difficult climates and context. We're doing this virtually due to a pandemic, and we're dealing with a lot as a country. So why is this important? With helping your students find where they are, you're giving them actionable steps. You're giving them tools and resources where they are. You're helping to develop resiliency. And if any of you who are verbal expressive, especially when I'm thinking of my middle to high schoolers, they're expecting that from you. They're like, I see this. Do you see me? Do you see how difficult this is? Can you give me reasonable, practical, applicational resources for me, depending on what I need? And remembering that all students need access to a free, appropriate public education, and that looks, depending on this, I remind myself that whenever I'm supporting schools, like, well, this person has this disability, it's like, yeah, you met one kid with that disability. That doesn't speak to all of those students. And we have to be mindful of that as educators, that every child is different, every family is different, every community is different. So what I like to do whenever we're having these conversations is give you the context and give you the history. So I chose some different communities just so you can have an idea of the work that we've done and all the great progress we've made, and also how recent some of that progress has been. So let's start with, I believe, individuals with disabilities. So when I was pulling different milestones, it was surprising to see how recent we developed a lot of legislation for those with disabilities. So that kind of helped me to understand, like, okay, we just got to a place where we're recognizing these people, and we still have so much more progress to make. Especially for me, working as a school psychologist, seeing that legislation for, I want to say it was 1975, education for all handicapped children is signed in 1975. And it took, I want to say it was the first George Bush, senior, because he had a child who had a reading disability, who passed the American with Disabilities Act. And seeing all the progress, like, it's very, things that I'm in the realm of special education, like looking at IDEA and Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, but these just came about. Like, there are adults now who can speak to a time when they were in school and they didn't have these protections. They didn't have special education services. They didn't have a Section 504 that gave them accommodations. And just kind of being mindful of, yeah, we've made a lot of progress, but we still have so much more room to grow, and supporting and thinking about that for you as an educator, for your populations. Though this was pretty interesting, that the 19th Amendment allowed white women to vote. I didn't know that, but finding that at that time, privileged white women were able to vote. I want to say women get that. right until 1965, around like the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, and all that. And seeing who was able to be appointed to positions of power with Sandra Day in 1981, the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. We had our first female attorney general in 1993, and then 2013, U.S. military movements against women serving in combat positions. Like a lot of these, it's always interesting when I go over the context and the history. I'm surprised by how long it took to get to certain places. Yes, Janie, it's unbelievable that it took so long to get some of this legislation. You're like, again, as a person that works in special education, I was surprised that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in the 90s. Like there were people who didn't have that protection for such a long time. And then looking to see, as we all just lived through 2021, Kamala Harris is the first woman and first woman of color to become the US vice president. So again, women in leadership roles and how recent that has been for us. Individuals that identify as LGBTQ+, going through this history, very eye-opening. Again, 1950, President D. Eisenhower, he signs an executive order banning people who identified as queer from federal government employment. That was interesting. And then going forward to 1969, seeing that the police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, that actually kind of helped launch the gay civil rights movement. Again, 1969. It's been interesting to see like the legislation and some of those barriers that were in place. And then moving forward, 1993, President Bill Clinton signs Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where you just basically didn't acknowledge if someone was LGBTQ and you didn't talk about it, right? And I know my husband, he's in the Air Force, and having peers that were a part of that time and they were able to speak to that time. And then moving forward, like the first legalized same-sex union takes place in 2004 in Massachusetts. It's very, whenever any Holly hears me say this a lot, there's so much to learn because there's so much that, especially around these issues around equity, diversity, inclusion, you don't really know. But you all to feel empowered to learn the history because it really helps you understand like how we got here. Those who you'll see me say African and Black Americans. Some in that community will utilize the African Americans. They feel some identity, some don't. African Americans, usually the origin of that came from, of course, the slave trade, not necessarily knowing that ancestry. So you just say from the continent of Africa. And that's why you have some people who don't really like being referred to as African American. They prefer Black because they feel more of an Blackness, being a Black American. Blackness was created here as a social construct. So that's why you'll see me use those interchangeably. So at the Black, I started in 19 with the first 20 Africans that were brought to the United States before it was United States. And I'm just kind of seeing a lot of the history around getting rights and protections for those who identify as Black, African American. You'll see there's a lot that took place throughout the 1800s that it's very contextual. So I wanted to make sure I spoke to it, especially around voting. I don't think we understand a lot of the Jim Crow and those segregation laws. So I wanted to make sure that I put that in because that was 1871. And then some of the rice riots that I saw. I'm learning a lot about that time period from the migration from the South. Those Black people who were Black African American who went from the South, went to the North seeking jobs and just a better quality of life. And then how their presence led to a lot of race riots and a lot of resentment for them coming to those communities. Highly recommend reading up on that history just to have that understanding of that context and that historical knowledge. and then seeing how recent legislation was passed, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, showing that separating children in public schools on the basis of race unconstitutional, and then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act back-to-back, 1964, 1965. There's a lot of history in this work, and I'm learning a lot about it as I do it, just to kind of give you, again, the context and that background. So I want you to think, again, we're going to do a poll everywhere. You can respond at pollev.com, my first and last name 591, or you can send a text, my first and last name 591 to 37607. But how does viewing these milestones across intersectional identities help us as educators? And I really want you to think about how recent some of these milestones took place, and thinking about, too, some of the communities that you support. How is this showing up for you? And why is this valuable for you to know as an educator? And I'll go to the slide where you can see the responses. Just take a moment to kind of reflect and think about it. I want to give you the opportunity to do that in real time as we have this conversation. There's still a lot of work to do. Power and trust, absolutely. I will get into more of that. Yes. Modern day equity. You'll see me looking to the side. I have two screens up. And we'll go over laws. Yes. As I look at the community, yes, absolutely. Yes. I agree. I agree. A lot of these are sociological. So zooming out is very powerful. Absolutely. Great discussion. Yes, traditions, because again, who created those? And I'll get into that too. Yes, kids are much more receptive. Yes, they are. They're not as set ways yet. Thank you for the discussion. All right, so I want to give you tools and kind of give you the terminology. So be mindful of fragility, because, and me and Holly talk about this a lot, about the equity specialist with USBE, is just that initial feeling you may have, that discomfort, and being able to label it. You might struggle because you feel like it is a challenge to you as a person, as a good moral person, right? That's something we hear a lot. But at work, at your best, just work to be goodish, and that's okay. You're human. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, especially as educators, to know it all, to be it all, to have be able to handle everything, and you won't know everything, and that's okay. I tease a lot of my colleagues. One of them, she hates when I say this. I'm like, yeah, you're going to die not knowing a lot of things, and that's okay because you're human. But we're all in this trying to achieve a growth mindset of learning to, and again, I'm gonna say it again, you're unlearning a lot and you're re-educating, and there's a lot of humility there, and there's a lot of vulnerability and empathy there, and that's okay. But as educators, we have to have that willingness to continue to grow. especially if you're working and supporting people who you may not be familiar with. You got to be willing to step into that space of stretching and that willingness to learn. So reflect. These are just questions to get you to think. You don't necessarily need to respond, but if you want to, you can definitely do so in the chat box. And I'll read them aloud. So when watching TV or a movie, how likely are you to watch shows whose characters reflect your ethnicity, race, gender, ability level, religion, gender identity, and or sexual orientation? So just think about that. And if you do see you or your likeness, what is that perception? Is it a broad perception? Is it positive? Is it negative? Do you think it's a full depiction of you? So let's talk about social media. When using social media, how diverse feed? How diverse friends? How diverse are those that follow you? Think about how inclusive are those spaces. And I know that we're hearing a lot about silos, basically like how broad is the world that you expose yourself to? How inclusive is it? Privilege. I want to give you another word that you may be hearing about so you can understand it. With privilege, it is unearned advantages that are highly valued, but usually restricted to certain groups. And the dominant culture gets to determine what that looks like. And we're able to see one of the things that I've noticed in the pandemic, you're able to see a lot of that in a very clear way. So being born into a wealthy family gives you access and opportunities that you may not have if you don't have wealth, right? So being able to access education and mental health and medical services, and we kind of got to see that at the beginning of the pandemic, like who was able to get tested for COVID-19 versus who couldn't. And then two, with privilege, being able to walk in places and being able to walk into a store without being perceived as a suspicious person. And I'll use myself as an example in this one. When the first week that I moved to Utah, I was followed home by law enforcement. And that just rang very clearly to me that something about my being didn't belong in my community. Think about that for your students in your community, the spaces that they occupy and where they are perceived as belonging to an environment versus where they're not. Because that looks different depending on where you are. You all know your community. Very big word, but I want you to understand because it's talking about access and power and opportunity. So it's looking at domination and it's looking at one is unmuted. Sunny, mute yourself. It's looking at submission, it's sexism, racism, homophobia, classism, colonialism, all the isms, but I want you to be able to see it visually. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. And I want you to spend time. So on the top of the circle is privilege. This is the access and opportunity. So being able-bodied, being upper and middle class, being of the majority religion, being white, being male. But on the flip side is the oppression side, the resistance side. So being of color, being old, dark, being of the minority religion. And so I'll use myself so you can kind of start thinking about how this looks. Because again, looking at yourself and your students in your community from a multi-dimensional perspective. So for me, able-bodied on the top, I am highly literate, upper middle class. I am, let's see, I know there's an Anglophone. I speak English. So on the flip side of that, the things that kind of work against that access and opportunity, being a woman, being a person of color, being a person who's perceived as dark. So I want you I want you to have an understanding of power, because it's not something that we feel common. I don't think we're trained about it a lot, especially when I did my work with my national association. Age is on there. Age is definitely on there. The old versus young, that's what it's alluding to. There's a lot, definitely having that conversation during this pandemic, especially for our older population. Like, what does that look like for you? Do you get access to, depending on your background, right? But not everyone has the same access, especially around age and what resources you have. So looking at power structure. So coloniality, that's basically the aftermath of colonialism. So what took place, which took shape after the colonies. Again, it's something you talk about probably in elementary, not so much as you get older, but it's been very influential in like our laws and our policies and our culture. Because if you travel abroad, you're able to see that places that weren't influenced by colonialism, they may have a different culture, but our culture is very transactional, very hierarchical, very owned. And it influenced a lot of our disciplines, and I'll talk about that later. So I wanted to make sure that I got a lot of just requests for, can you kind of talk about racism in a way that we can understand? So I wanted to make sure that I gave you space for that and kind of walked you through the context within the United States. Okay, so let's get into historical racism. The way we learn it is typically from the culture, and what I mean by that is who did the colonizing, they were able to determine the history and what read forward. But it doesn't always talk about the racism within policies and actions of the US government. And we're learning a lot of that right now. It's in the zeitgeist. We're reading the books about, okay, what does this look like? Because not a lot of us have that language or that knowledge. So I wanted to make sure I provided some context for that. But looking at access, so how communities of color fare in basic areas of education and housing. So we had things like, and I'm gonna go over them in further slides, but just the redlining where communities of color were put in certain places throughout cities. You can see there map communities of color and how that's taken shape over time, which schools they could go to, where they can get jobs where you do, and that's not something we're all aware of. And then thinking about genocide of indigenous people, and then the continued breaking of numerous treaties, the conversation on that right now. So I wanted to make sure I talked about some of these things. The internment of those of Japanese ancestry during World War II and not those of German ancestry. And then the encoding of enslavement of African Americans until the passage of the 13th Amendment. And then looking into Jim Crow. So the segregation and the laws that were used to continue that profiling. And I'll get into that more. So this is just to give you a visualization of how long some of these things were. I'll look into that, Dorothy, to see, but not to my knowledge. But I'm always trying to learn. So if I need to correct that, I will. So with looking at American slavery from 1619 to 1865, and then segregation, how long that took, and then into mass incarceration, because with the 13th Amendment, there is written in a component that led to even more incarceration. And I want to highlight the documentary that talked about. It's called The 13th. Well, basically that led into more mass incarceration, particularly for those of color and in lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Highly recommend. There's a lot of resources out there to kind of help you understand the context. I try to remember them while we're having the conversation. Systemic racism. So again, going into the system, we talked about a little bit of the history very briefly, because I only have so much time with you. But looking into the systems that perpetuate the racial injustice, that it's not the disposition of the person. There's a lot of conversation right now around victimhood and victim blaming. So I want to give you language so you can understand the context and kind of zoom out. So with systemic racism, you got to be mindful of how it's embedded into the system. So looking into the policies, into the legislation, particularly around Jim Crow, was very clear. If you read the work, Isabel Wilkerson, she has a book called The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, and she goes through all the legislation and talks about the Great Migration, what kind of led to it, because of honestly the violence and the terrorism of living in the Jim Crow South and that level of oppression and lack of access and opportunities. So what that led to, and then how you still saw in response to those communities moving to the north and the northeast and even to the west, the inequitable housing and the economic policies that led them to still have substandard housing even after that Great Migration and lack of access, and us just not recognizing that these communities still didn't have access to the same housing. Thank you, Dorothy. Didn't have access to housing, didn't have access to the same jobs. If they were hired in certain places, they didn't get promoted, they didn't get the same wages. So really looking into the system as a whole and seeing who was impacted. Because again, I want you to understand the access component. That's why a lot of this is important. So you can understand, like, how do we get here and why are we having these conversations? And why are these conversations so difficult? But again, regardless of the intention, I want you to understand, because we often get caught up in, am I still a good person? Did I say the right thing? You're human. You're not gonna know everything, and that's okay. And with this work, there's a lot, again, unlearning and re-educating. Yes, Dell. There's a lot of immigrants. And as I look at that history, there's a lot of harm that was done to immigrant populations of all flavors, and how they were put into ghettos and they couldn't get hired. My husband and I were watching a documentary talking about California and how difficult that was for Chinese immigrants and Italian immigrants, but definitely learning a lot of the history is very, very helpful to just give you that context. I can provide, if you look at my Padlet, I have a huge breakdown of all the laws and policies. So definitely check that out. Let me see if I have, you can go on a deep dive and look at the policies and the laws. I want to say Harvard has a really good link on there. So again, we're talking about race, so I want to give you tools. So the triangle of white supremacy, this kind of lets you see what's socially unacceptable versus what's socially acceptable and how that changes over time. So I wanted to give you a visual. So we know some things avert white supremacy that are very socially unacceptable. We know blackface, and we know not to use the N-word, and we know racial slurs. But there's a lot of things that we've kind of normalized, we being people, that are covert. So saying things like English only. I know for us at USBE, we have learned to say multilingual, because that language helps to embrace the diversity of language rather than you're learning English, so English language learners, and centering English. So again, moving to strength-based versus deficit-based. So, and again, cultural appropriation is another thing that you probably heard of with, like, why is that an issue? So not giving acknowledgement to where a lot of these things come from. I know that's been a huge conversation with yoga, remembering the roots of it and giving acknowledgement and respect and credit to where that came from in the origin. I'm looking at the chat box. And is the instruction more perceptible in data and outcomes and stem from laws that appear neutral? I do feel like some laws appear neutral. I will stop and acknowledge that. Yeah. Yes. So again, you have error in how humans implement these policies, right? Because we are functioning in a society that has normalized a lot of these things. So again, I want us to not focus on like the person themselves being good or bad. Don't fall into the false dichotomy of goodness versus badness, but being aware of the disproportionality, because that's our goal with having these conversations, is to learn, like, how do we do this better? So that if this policy, if this law isn't equitable, how do we change it to where it is? Do we need to do better training? Do we need to alter the law? Do we need to have more inclusive? Because I've had inclusive stakeholders, right? I've had conversations around that, like, oh, Casey, our demographics have changed, but our policies haven't. What are your recommendations? Like, well, have your policy makers change? Because sometimes that's a factor as well. Do you have different stakeholders in the room as you're shaping these policies? Because that can help you to be more inclusive and make more equitable decisions, because you have different stakeholders in the room. I want to be mindful of time, so I'll go to the next one. This triangle just kind of helps. I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge like the violence that comes along with some of this indifference in the conversations around racism. You can do a triangle like this for any marginalized community. So you want to be thinking about everything from indifference to genocide. Like, how do we get there? And we are having those conversations in a very public way. Like, how do we get to a place where I'm just saying, oh, that doesn't affect me. And then you're having mass shootings. Like, I saw a report today saying like we've had like 50 mass shootings since the one in Georgia. So I want to understand for myself, like, how do we get to a place of this doesn't bother me, this doesn't impact me, to, oh, this is something that now I'm having conversations in the classroom about. So I want to make sure that as I put these together, I'm giving you the language so you can understand, like, oh, this is how you get from indifference to veiled racism to calls for violence. And again, this is just looking at racism because that was the request. And I'm looking at chat. Yes, who is given a seat at the table? Absolutely. Very impactful. So with defining white supremacy, again, I want to give you tools for the words you're hearing. Its dominance and its power and its access over those who can fit. Because some of you are talking about this in the chat box. Yes, I'll be sharing, Dale, the PDF of the presentation after today, after the conversation. I always withhold it. I feel like you don't engage as much until, and then I'll give you the PDF afterwards. So yes, I'll make sure it's accessible. But I want you to be mindful of, and some of you talked about this, the whiteness, the umbrella of whiteness has changed over time. And at the beginning of the 1900s, those who were identified as white was very different from 2021. So that has changed, but there are certain groups who will never be able to fall under that. And that's why you're hearing, like, what is white supremacy? Why is it a conversation? Why is it something that people are talking about so much? So I want you to understand it. It's talking about who gets access and who doesn't. So you're hearing a lot of conversation around rights. And you're hearing a lot of conversation around colorism in certain communities. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge it. White privilege, another thing you may be hearing about. So with white privilege, again, those who can fall under that umbrella getting greater access to opportunities and resources, and those who don't fall under the umbrella of whiteness being historically marginalized. In a system that values whiteness, those who can fall under whiteness tend to benefit. That's ultimately what I want to communicate and get you to understand. But it doesn't discount your effort, because I know that a lot of people are like, well, if I'm white and I grew up poor, does that mean if you are in a system that values whiteness, you'll have benefits for being white? But it doesn't deny your effort and your hard work. It's just saying that in a system that values whiteness, whiteness is more valuable than not having whiteness. So things to think about. Again, if you have a reaction or a thought, you can put it in the chat box, but I just want you to think about these. So if you are a person that identifies as a white person, when was the last time you worried about being followed in a shopping store? When you were in school, how many teachers reflected your race, your ethnicity? When was the last time you felt unsafe walking down a sidewalk, even in broad daylight? Did you see yourself reflected in media during your childhood? And then thinking, even something as simple as a bandage reflects the influence of white privilege in our society. And that was something that stuck out to me, is the colors of the bandages. And things like that, in relation to like stockings, like that's been a big conversation. You're seeing companies come out with stockings that have colors of all ethnicities. Yes, Chrissy. Again, because being a woman, it's a part of a marginalized community. So there is fear in being a woman, depending on where you are. No, I'm an avid traveler, and there are some countries I felt very unsafe because I was a woman. It wasn't my ethnicity. It was, I'm a woman and I'm getting responses from this environment that I might not be safe here. Definitely. And that's something that I have to think about for my students. Safety has been, and I'll be honest with you all, I haven't felt the most safe in Utah in the last year. Utah has been the most challenging place I've lived in all the places I've lived, and I'm going to be honest about that. I want to be honest because I think about my students and the people that reach out to me and call me and community members who are having really hard times right now. And so safety is something that I took for granted at the beginning of the pandemic, and I don't anymore. And I'm like, if I don't feel safe, and I'm a very privileged person, what is that like for my students? What is it like for my community members who don't have the same access and opportunities as me? Thank you, Becky. Because that's real, and I get a lot of voicemails and emails about students not feeling safe. My kids that are Asian American, Pacific Islander, I get a lot of feedback from the field right now that they're not safe. They don't feel safe. They don't feel welcome. Yes, Chrissy. And we do. We get in our bubbles and you're in your silo and you don't hear about different. And that's, I always tell, and Holly hears me say this a lot, broaden that bubble. You'll be a better practitioner for it. So some mindset shifts. These are just things I want you to think about. As I work, and give you some things and relational tools. Really, will not to prioritize the comfort and interest with privilege over progress towards equity. Easier said than done. Our default is to, I'll think about this in terms of history. Whenever we have new just like a backlash, and those, but what we have to do, we tend to do a lot of acquiescing to those who are loud and belligerent, use a lot of bullying behavior. Now, and if we're open opportunities for our students, you're going to have that. You're going to have some people who don't think that that should be done. But I want us to be mindful of prioritizing the comfort of those people over those who have been historically marginalized. So prioritizing them over kids with disabilities, over those who are multilingual learners. Those people have had opportunities and they have been centered. and it's okay for them not to be centered at times. And to deal with, I can do that. Can you hear me now? Thumbs up if you can hear me. I'm shaky again. Let me, thanks, Michelle. I'll do that. Let me turn off my video. There we go. Yeah, I saw that too, Alonzo. It's a very slow connection. All right, let me know, because I can't see. Where's my, I see my chat. I turned off my video, so now I can't see you. Better? All right, Marie, you just have to give me feedback because I can't see. Perfect. It was, yes, the video was taking all my audio. All right, so let's talk about toxic positivity. That's something that comes up a lot as well. Good example of this. We tend to, in this conversation around equity on what you like over what on the negative. Well, want to move forward in improving equitable practices, right? I think, and that's why I wanted to give you a lot of the context. We're cutting out again. Sound is really a problem. All right, let me try something. I'm going to pause and I'm going to reconnect. So let me stop sharing. I have a backup connection just in case.
See, I did notice it looks like it's trying to generate like closed captioning on yours. I don't know if that's something, maybe we could turn that off if that's part of it.
Let me.
Just an idea.
No, I saw that it auto generates on mine. Oh, I see the transcript is known to often cause what I mentioned. Yes.
Yeah, and it looks like a few individuals were commenting about the live transcription might be what's eating up so much of the bandwidth.
Okay, so quickly, how do I turn that off? It's on my presentation. If you don't know, I'm
sure about. Sorry.
Okay, well, here's what I'll do. I will use another connection, but they log me out. So I'm going to disconnect from this one real quick, and I'll jump back on another connection. I apologize, friends. Technical difficulties. All right.
You know, after 13 months, I think we're used to all of the interesting technology.
Oh, really? I know.
Someone commented that if you go into your Zoom account settings, you can turn it off there. While we are on a break for a minute here, a few questions have come in. We are recording this, so you will be able to go back and watch different parts, or if you have to help a student or something, we are recording. It looks like Casey's back now. Donald did pose a question in chat. He said, within the world of education, what is the difference between equity and equal access to opportunity? And it looks like Alonzo commented that was an interesting question. There was an op-ed this morning from Ben Carson that tried to make a distinction between equality and equity. So maybe that's something that Casey can also address for us. She is back. So without further ado, we'll turn the time back over to her.
Okay, so let me see if I can see the chat. Can you hear me? I won't turn on my video. I switched
Yes, we
connection.
can hear you. Yep, sounds good.
Okay, good. All right, so the difference, I will get into the difference between equity and equal. Equity, I look at kind of from my lens as a special educator, someone with a special education background. You're giving support based off of what the needs are. Equal, you're giving everyone the same thing. So with equity, it's very similar to specially designed instruction, where it's I'm designing this instruction and the support and the resources to your needs. Whereas equal is everyone gets the same resources and the same instruction, so there's no difference there. But I'll go into more detail on that. And I think what I'll do after this presentation is I'll turn off. Good suggestion on the transcripts, because that might be what's taking a lot of my bandwidth. All right, let me exit those things out. All right. So let's get to, so we talked about toxic positivity. Let's move on to basically with understanding privilege, it's not visible to the holder of it. What I usually say is it's kind of like telling a fish that it's in water for the first time. You've experienced your whole life without an awareness that it even exists. But recognizing that there's a difference in experience depending on what you have access to and what you don't. So what we have to be mindful of, especially for those of us who do have privilege, is not to deny that it exists. So again, like I said at the beginning of this, is that having that willingness to engage with different perspectives and people that have very different lived experiences from you. So with looking at privilege in schools, it really is impactful on discipline, what I found, and then that stigma of kids of color being perceived as criminals. And some things that I've ran into locally is just the perception, because I'll talk to a school leader and they're saying, well, this kid just looked like they were up to no good. And I'll ask, okay, so can you kind of tell me more about that? And what do you mean by that? And well, they had on headphones or they were dressed a certain way. So helping us to understand that our communities may look different than us. The students we support typically look different than us if you look at our data. So being mindful of some of the perceptions and those quick decisions that we make about kids, especially in reference to discipline. So I want you to think, again, these are just reflection questions. And if you have a thought, you can put it in the chat box, but I really just want you to kind of think and give you time to think in real time. So think about how diverse your school culture is. How diverse is your school culture? How do you feel when you are in a community that is different than your neighborhood? So let's transition into historical trauma. Some of you, yes, there was a conversation about trust in communities, and I'll get into that with this topic. So with understanding historical trauma, recognizing that there has been trauma in particular groups, depending on their level of marginalization. And you may experience that within your school setting. So recognizing historical trauma has three components. Usually it's a traumatic event. It's a shared experience by a particular group of people, but there's a multi-generational impact of that trauma. With historical trauma, we have to be mindful of that these major events are usually forced upon this group of people. And the examples that I provided kind of refer to war, extreme poverty, genocide, violent colonization, forced migration. And some of you may have this, you see the impact of historical trauma within your communities. So I want to give you some of that language because it does impact your ability to build relationships and your communication. And I know every time I move, I have to kind of educate myself on the community in that historical context. It's really valuable to have that understanding because then you're able to recognize some of the stress responses and some of that, like I was mentioning earlier, that communication. And you might see there's a concern with trust in that community building. So having an understanding of that historical trauma really helps you to understand that history and why there might be some mistrust there. But recognizing with historical trauma that it doesn't just happen to that particular generation, it's something that typically carries forward. So I'll talk about two groups, Black and African Americans, and then I'll go into Indigenous people. So with Black and African Americans, there's a lot of race-related traumatic events. Everything from the transatlantic slave trade to the forced family separation and the forced assimilation, denial of rights, mass incarceration. Usually when you see this conversation, there's a tendency to say that experience is not real, it's not different, it's not unique. And we have to be mindful of letting people have space to have their lived experience, especially if it's not something that's familiar to you or you don't understand that historical background. And recognizing that it's intergenerational and that there's an experience. When I look at the writing of James Baldwin, he talks about this. He was a very influential writer from the 40s to the 60s, I believe. And he talked about how it impacts your self-worth and your self-esteem. And it really made me think about my kids with disabilities, my kids who are queer, my kids of lower socioeconomic status, my multilingual learners, and how they feel about their experiences. Because they don't always have the language to communicate, but I can tell that they're very, very aware of those identities and where that puts them in society and what that means for them. Will they be able to go to college? Will they be able to find a job? Will they be able to be treated with respect and dignity and humanity? And I know that's a conversation we're having very openly nationally. So I want to give space for it. Going into the experience of those who are Native Americans, Indigenous people, that the history of colonization and being forced into schools where they couldn't speak their native language, they couldn't practice their cultural traditions, having to suppress their identities, being told that you need to become more civilized, and what does that mean? What's being centered when you say your culture and your customs aren't civilized? And being very careful. That's why I say language is very important. It's very powerful in what you're centering and what you're not. And students are very aware. I'm always surprised by what they're aware of and what they can speak to and when they can. And it was disheartening to see the suicide rate for the indigenous community. It's the highest of any ethnic group, and it's 4 times higher. And that's a big population for us. We have indigenous students in communities. And the health outcomes in those who are significantly impacted right now during COVID-19, they're lower socioeconomic status groups and people of color and usually frontline workers. So I want to make sure I give you things to consider, especially as you navigate these conversations around trauma, depending on your community, depending on your population. Recognizing that some may be triggered. I have a lot of leaders that reach out to me like, how do I have these conversations? How do I honor those emotional responses? Like, well, give them tools, recognize them. What we tend to do is it makes us nervous, makes us anxious, and we'll shut down. But giving space, giving language to say, I hear you. And then sometimes you will step in it, allow yourself to have that and experience that discomfort. Doesn't feel great, but increase your capacity to go into those spaces and help your staff navigate those spaces and navigate that context and give them resources to do so they can feel empowered and they're not isolated. A lot of the feedback I get from educators is I don't want to feel alone and my students are asking for this, or I have community members who are reaching out to me. What do I do? But then two, we talked about equitable policies earlier when we were talking about historical and systemic racism. So if you see things that are highly inequitable, wherever you are and whatever role you have, being able to speak to that and acknowledge it. And okay, so what can we do? What's a viable solution for our population if this isn't working and this is inequitable? And what we have to be mindful as educators is that if something is not working for a particular group of people, not to blame the people. There's something wrong with the system. Sometimes for us, it's something wrong with the institution or the curriculum. Some of you mentioned in the chat box earlier, yeah, we need different stakeholders. We need different people in the room. So thinking, how do we, because you might have to make some changes structurally, and that's something we're having a very broad conversation nationally and statewide. Okay, are there some structural elements that we can influence and address and change? And this is another just giving you some tools as you navigate this. Be mindful of unhealthy peace. And what I mean by that is that there's a tendency to, well, this is peaceful. And it's not really, right? Because remember, those marginalized voices don't feel peaceful. But those who benefit tend to have this peace, and they usually want to maintain it. But you can't. You can engage in these conversations, and we're doing it. We're having this conversation on equity, diversity, inclusion, and we're bringing it up. Okay, this is what I heard. Let me share this resource with you. You can do it. But like this slide, it's saying you can do it if you're trying to resolve an issue, right? It can be helpful if it means a problem is being solved. So there has to be a willingness. Just like I said earlier, if the policy is inequitable, and that's our goal, is to make them more equitable, then yes, let's problem solve around that. And that's the goal. Just being mindful not to maintain peace just to avoid conflict. Because again, you want to build your ability to step into that discomfort, to stretch, to listen to multiple perspectives. So again, thinking, these are just questions to get you to think, and if you have a response, you can put it in the chat box. How do you respond when others make negative statements towards individuals of a different ethnicity, race, gender, ability level, religion, sexual orientation, and or gender identity than yourself? How often do you go to social settings where most individuals are of a different ethnicity, race, gender, ability level, religion, sexual orientation, and or gender identity than yourself. Things to consider, especially in our current climate. I want to give you practical tools and considerations. You're going to have to navigate some friction, especially if you have different stakeholders, and some of you are working in spaces where you do have different stakeholders. You got different people from different ethnicities, different lived experiences, different religions, different generations, right? So you have to develop the tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty and develop those skills. So I'm finding a lot of us are learning those things when we're not used to being in spaces where we don't all have the same lived experiences, different skill sets. I know for me, working on multidisciplinary teams, I learned a ton, and I had much more solid interventions when I was partnering with my speech language pathologist and my social worker and my other school psychologists and my teachers, my special education teachers, general ed teachers, my principal, district leadership. Having those different perspectives was helpful. And yeah, sometimes you did have confrontations, but you're usually working together for the benefit of the student, for the benefit of the community. So being able to build our ability to do that and add those skills whenever we don't have them will go a long way. So another poll everywhere question, just to get you to think about, so how can I make my school more inclusive and sensitive? You can participate by going to pollev.com, my first and last name, 591, or sending a text to my first and last name, 591 to 37607. But I want to give you an opportunity to kind of think about how can you make your school more inclusive and sensitive? What does that look like? And you may be doing that now, so just share so we can take notes and get ideas. Yes, that's a great idea. Review and update policies that are not inclusive. Start having the conversations with staff around implicit bias and structures, helpful conversation. Yes, attendance. Yeah, because we get better as you attend more of these, you do build your ability to have these conversations. Yeah. Yes, ask for stakeholder feedback, including them, especially if you're making decisions about your community, you want to have them in the room. Yes, looking at behavior data, schools are doing, I think schools doing that, looking at their behavior data, looking at their referrals, having community involvement goes a long way as well, especially with building relationships with your community and having schools that feel inclusive, like you're taking in consideration the ideas and the feedback from your community goes a long way. I've had schools tell me that. Being open to different ideas. Yes, being open. Being willing to hear someone outside of yourself. A lot of times it's very valuable to listen, especially if you're a person that likes to speak. It's a good conversation. So let's talk about, some of you have alluded to this. I want to make sure that I address disproportionality and discipline. We talked about that as a state a few board meetings back about disproportionality. School to prison pipeline, some of you have heard of it, so I want to make sure that I just label it so you have an idea of what it means and why it has came to be. But just looking at some of our policies and practices that have led students into more restrictive settings. So juvenile justice systems or alternative education programs. So looking at the research around the school to prison pipeline, there is significant disproportionality in the use of out-of-school suspension, specifically for kids of color and children with disabilities. And when I was looking and going over my task force for my national association, looking at how Black students are 3.8 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. But if they have a Black teacher, they're 3 times more likely to be referred to gifted programs. That was something that was eye-opening. And then looking at the outcomes for students who are suspended, they're up to 10 times more likely to drop out. So really thinking about our practices, and I'll get into more of these later, but looking more into restorative practices, positive behavior interventions and support, social and emotional learning support, that can be very valuable in developing skills. I feel like in education, we got it when it comes to academics. That makes sense to us. Like, yes, you need an intervention, you need improved instruction around this academic skill deficit. You're not reading or you're struggling with math. That makes sense. But whenever it comes to behaviors, that's where we usually like, well, what do we do? So I'm seeing a lot of good programming and instruction around social and emotional learning now, especially right now. So what can we do around disproportionality? Some of you mentioned this, which is great. So evaluate your school discipline strategies, making sure that they're beneficial. And then replacing one size fits all, because that's something that we did. I want to say around the 80s and 90s, we were really big on zero tolerance. And ever since then, we've had more research around showing that's not best practice. So what does that look like? Improving culture responsive practices, having conversations like the one we're having today, making sure your professional learning opportunities are more inclusive in that you're looking at your data and you're looking at your referrals, and then increasing representation of your community. So whether that's people of color, you want to have community members present. I've gotten a lot of feedback from schools whenever before the pandemic, walking through, I'd have community members tell me like, I like this school because I see us here. They put up pictures of us. They put up pictures of our kids around the school. It feels like a community, rather like a community space rather than like a very cold building. So let's talk about equity. So as I mentioned earlier, equality is giving people the same. Equity is more individualizing it depending on the need. So it's not going to look the same because the needs are different. And again, equality is just, it's not enough to combat years of oppression and poverty and disproportionality and kind of things we talked about with perpetual subjugation and discrimination and redlining. And with equity, you are taking all of that context into consideration and supporting students based off of what that need is. So this infographic kind of helps visually to kind of explain the differences. You can see with the equality image, everyone has the same. Equity, it's varied depending on what you need. And with justice is basically equity in practice. You're removing those barriers. And some of you, I'm looking at the chat box, you're talking about this. So you're removing policies that are not equitable. You're changing laws that are not equitable. And we're seeing that locally, you're seeing that nationally. Equity, I wouldn't say means guaranteeing outcomes because we can't do that. We're human, you can't guarantee, but you are tailoring supports depending on the needs. So you're trying to improve outcomes and access and opportunities, but you're altering that based off of the need of the students. You're not saying that I can guarantee you'll have this outcome because you can't. Now, with the path to equity, we have to be mindful that it has to start with identifying. You won't get to the place of eliminating inequity or cultivating equity. And I saw a lot of the public comment kind of talking about this. So we have to be mindful that if you're trying to improve equitable practices, you really have to make sure that you identify what those inequities are first. Then you can get to a place of eliminating, and then you can cultivate. A lot of us want to get to cultivating without identifying what those inequities are to begin with. Right, and I see, I'm looking at the chat box. Not necessarily, but again, we want to be of the mind as educators that you're providing the support. But yes, you can't make someone, but I want to be mindful that we are crafting the resources and the instruction so they can. And again, we are framing from strength-based, not deficit-based. So let's talk about some of the ways we can shift our practice. We're hearing a lot of color blindness, color evasion versus power evasion. I want to break that down because I have heard a lot of conversation around colorblind, and I want to give you tools and resources. So for color evasion, that is basically the denial of the racial differences by emphasizing sameness, right? So you have the same treatment, doesn't matter what your skin color is. Power evasion is denying racism and access and opportunities that are based off of racism. Again, whiteness, access, you give more access and power and opportunities for a system that values whiteness. So power evasion is looking at the power, and then color evasion is looking at the denial of treatment due to skin color. And just giving you a visual of color evasion versus power evasion, just so you have an understanding of color blindness. Because I know it might be something that you're hearing, like, is that something we say still? Is that something with color blindness you want to be mindful of? In a system that values whiteness, you want to see someone's color because you're seeing their lived experience. And again, it's up to them to tell you what that is as a person who's experiencing a system that values whiteness over not having whiteness. And I'm looking at the chat box. I want to acknowledge that before moving on, because I'm hearing a lot of conversation around victim mentality without necessarily giving space for the people who are marginalized by the system to speak. So as a person of color, I don't perceive myself as a victim. But I do feel as an educator, we need to be, and the research suggests best practice around strength-based. So not deficit thinking, right? So you want to, as an educator, be thinking about the strengths. What do these students have? And how can we get them to a place where they can have more access and opportunities with these strengths, rather than deficit thinking is that, well, they're not going to do these things and they're raised that way, and all of these negative attributes, because it's very much deficit, deficient, devaluing, denigrating language, when we could be, as educators, focusing on those strengths of what do you do well, what do you have, what opportunities can you have, because there's a lot of support that we can provide around strength-based thinking and supports. And there's a lot of good practice, and I put a lot of that on the Padlet to kind of help us to see, okay, with our mindset shifts, what can this look like? Because historically, we didn't always have that. There was a lot of deficit thinking. We're trying to get to a place where we're looking now as educators, looking at those strengths and using more language that is positive and gives more attributes. And I'm looking at the chat box and being mindful of time. Right. And let's look at telling us how they perceive their discrimination. Well, you want to be mindful that you're not creating a story or a narrative. So like I was talking about microaggressions, it's up to the person receiving that to determine if it's something that's denigrating or devaluing. Because sometimes we say things and we may not perceive it as being denigrating or devaluing, but it's up to the listener, to the receiver to determine that, not us. And that can be hard because you can say, well, I didn't mean it that way. It wasn't intentional. And that's okay. Remember, we're all trying to operate with growth mindset. Sometimes you will step into it and that's okay. You are human. We try to learn. All right, so let's transition into, I'll go forward, just want to be mindful of time. Yes, so we're having this conversation, perfect. Historically, as educators, we have been more on the what's wrong with you, again, that deficit thinking, a lot of that unfortunately blaming the individual, to now it's what happened to you and how can we help? So you're seeing more conversation around some of the topics I mentioned earlier, social and emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, because a lot of what I was remembering a previous conversation in the chat box, you were saying this is not just the school, and you're absolutely right. They're coming to school with a lot of sociological concerns. So our training is changing. So you're seeing us in conversations like this, and you're seeing pre-service conversations in institutions of higher ed, and you're like, okay, we need to train our educators on restorative practices, and they need to be aware of a multi-tiered system of support. And I know some of you are like, goodness, there's so much more than it was previously, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You have to be data informed, and you need to be trauma informed, and you need to know how to problem solve within a multidisciplinary team. So yes, there's a lot of changes that have been made even over the last few decades for us in education. So with that, we are having to apply an equity lens, and it's informing our practice differently, and being mindful of the structural inequities and what that looks like, particularly for our kids of color. When I look at the data around, especially for our kids of color and lower socioeconomic status, it looks different. Everyone's experiencing this pandemic very different. And a lot of those inequities have been exacerbated in a way that we haven't really seen. So I want to give you space during the conversation to think about in which ways can you apply an equity lens. And again, you go to pollev.com, Casey Dupart 591, or you can send a text to Casey Dupart 591 to 37607. And I'll go to the next slide so you can see. What are some things that you can implement, some changes? Stakeholder involvement. Yes, definitely policies and practices. Strength-based language, that's something that I'm constantly working on. Yes, recruitment across the board, absolutely. Board employees. Yes, multiple perspectives. It's very easy to have it one-dimensional, and we see it all the time in our meetings, and it's not always intentional. Absolutely say and do hard things. Mm-hmm. Yes, those inclusive conversations. I like that a lot. Role models for all kids in literature and life. It goes a long way. And I've had students tell me that simple things that you don't think about, like books, seeing themselves in books, in the teachers. Mm-hmm. Learning to be okay with the discomfort and building, again, that tolerance and that capacity. Thank you for that. So let's get into cultural responsiveness and give you some strategies. You really want to be knowledgeable of your culture and your climate. And I always tease educators on this, but I always say if you don't want to go to your job, then what does that mean about your students and your community members? So being aware of that climate, thinking about that, because that influences you, it influences students, having the capacity for self-assessment, learning how to listen, especially in a very extroverted culture that we have in the United States, being able to sit and listen, that's not always easy to do, and to reflect, making time for that. And then develop and adapting. Because I know some of you are probably navigating, okay, my demographics are changing, the needs of my students are changing, so I'm going to have to adjust, and I might have to think about hiring. I might have to think about professional learning differently in my policies. And that recognizing that it does have a real impact on student outcomes, it impacts disengagement and truancy. I've had a lot of conversations with school leaders about school refusal, and that's something that you have to navigate. It's like, how do I develop practices that are much more equitable and culture responsive so my students are willing to engage and come. Yes, Donald, I'm looking at the chat. Yes, student needs. You want, it's a lot of progress monitoring based off of the needs of the students, and bringing them in and helping them to develop that ownership of, like, this is your learning, especially as you get to those older grade levels. That's something that I had to learn how to do with my high school is, okay, so this is, now I want to bring you in. What support do you need? And getting them the skills to have that self advocacy and be able to be in a room and speak to that. Yes, littles can do it too. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. They usually want to be in meetings. They usually, I remember, I think some students by fourth or fifth grade, I had some students that wanted to be special ed meetings. They wanted to be there and they wanted to talk about, especially like behavior intervention plans, or I'm willing to work for this. This is the reward I want. And then how do you transition at home and getting parents to generalize those skills? That's a great, yes, Dorothy. Littles can definitely do it. But with cultural responsiveness, you're acknowledging a lot of that legitimacy of those cultural heritages, and you're looking at that context honestly, and you're valuing that stakeholder input. And you're building collaboration and developing those relationships. And you're using a lot of that universal design for learning, a lot of variety in your instruction. And you're teaching, again, that self advocacy for students. Like, how do you praise each other and recognize each other and see each other's humanity? Good question. Our first few steps I can incorporate into our board meetings. First step, I think we all have to be on the same page of valuing it. I do feel there's some equity literacy. And once you get to that place, I think we can start incorporating things from the field to build that awareness of equity literacy and its value. I would love to see what schools are doing around equity so we can make it more applicational and more communal, and not just something that only these districts and schools are doing. That's a great question. But we could definitely chat offline. How can we change how we do school? And I just wanted to pull some things like that I have seen throughout the pandemic around equity, but definitely helping students to affirm, again, strengths based, focusing on how do we build you up, So a lot of these kids may not have that. They may not be built up. Depending on your cultural background, I think of some of my students where they were told children are to be seen, not to be heard. So you're helping them to find their voice, to find that self-confidence and that sense of self-worth. And then giving that belongingness, showing that educators care of all flavors, not just teachers, but your speech language pathologist, your school counselor, your school social worker, your principal. That I definitely see the value, and I've seen that throughout the moves where that was done really well and kids really enjoyed the school and the people there versus when it wasn't there. And I have had some steps with that myself, with making sure that just acknowledging people goes a long way, and just speaking to people in the hallway. Definitely having engagement with your communities. I'm looking at the chat box, talking to the families. I want to be careful of not speaking so negatively of the families. I think everyone is struggling during this pandemic. So I want to say to that, because I see your chat, speaking to the families, asking them what supports could look like and how you can work together, rather than it being perceived as us as educators. And I've heard parents say this, you and all your letters and your credentials, devaluing them and making them feel like they aren't doing enough, because a lot of them are busy. A lot of them are working a lot. A lot of them have a lot on their plates. They may be the sandwich generation where they're taking care of their kids and they're taking care of their parents. So bringing them in, how do we help each other? And then with equitable learning environments, decentering, a lot of things are going to have to change, especially around structure. So what are you centering? Who are you inviting in to share that power with? And how are you co-designing? So sharing that space. And that can be a challenge when you're not used to sharing that. And I want to be mindful that it's a very challenging time. We weren't always trained to do this work, and you may not have had a lot of these conversations. And there are times when I'm very surprised that I'm in this role, because this is not what I saw myself doing as a school psychologist, behavior analyst, but I'm glad to do it. And I think we can do hard things, as someone mentioned earlier. We can do hard things. We have each other. And the last thing I will mention is that it's a developmental progression. As you develop your cultural responsiveness, you're moving, and it varies depending on whatever the topic is, right? So some of you may feel very strong supporting kids with disabilities, or you may feel very strong supporting kids who are multilingual learners, and not so much supporting kids who are queer or have a different religion, right? You may be more culturally blind there, or culturally cultural incapacity, right? And that's okay. We're all in a different place. But as long as you're working to improve and you're working to stretch and to learn, that's the goal. And I want to give you tools. Be willing to admit where you are on the journey. Remember that it's a constant study. You're constantly learning, you're constantly unlearning. But you want to do your part. And join communities that are going to stretch you. I've had to join a few that help me to unlearn and to re-educate, and find mentors and have those hard conversations. Empower your staff to have those, and you are modeling because you're a leader. You're constantly showing, okay, this is how we navigate this space. Let me give you tools. Let me point you in the right direction. Even if I don't know, let me make sure you find the resources. Let me connect you. And being mindful. I know that Martin Luther King Jr. has been heavily sanitized, unfortunately, but I do feel he was a very big advocate for improving equitable outcomes for everyone. And that's going to require your voice. It's going to require having hard conversations and changing structures that may not have been questioned, and that's okay. And with that, if you have any questions, you have my email, casey.dupart@schools.utah.gov. And we have about 5 minutes left.
Casey, do you want to open up for questions here? It sounds like we've got a little time left to do that.
Sure.
Awesome. So if anything comes in chat, I can read those, or if people want to unmute, we can certainly do that too. It looks like you've got a few great jobs. Somebody did mention that as educators, we can only focus on the place that we have influence in, where we can make decisions, and that's within a school.
Right. What you have the school setting. We do a lot. We do a lot of support from academics to social emotional learning. Some people separate that up to behavior, and we work on huge teams. They're growing now. They were much smaller when I first began. So you have a lot of space to develop really good practice and make a lot of really good decisions that can impact students long term. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there. And we do a lot of good work because I hear about it often.
All right. Well, I don't see any questions coming in on chat. I'm not sure if anyone wants to just unmute and ask a question too. Like I said, Casey, lots of thank yous and great job and good training. So I think it has been greatly appreciated by our leadership community. We are recording, so we will get that finished up and sent out. And then if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to your school portfolio manager, to myself, to Casey directly. We can all help answer your questions. If your school would like some additional training or work to do with this, that's also something we can help facilitate. So just like I said, let your portfolio manager know, let me know, let Casey know. We can all get you connected there. So, all right, well, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here.